Hello, and welcome to this EU5 video. Today I want to talk about a topic that I think is one of the reasons why the economy in EU5 feels a bit wonky and overpowered. But I haven't really seen too many people talk about it, just as a side note, but never really fully explaining the mechanic and its consequences on the game's economy. And that is utility buildings. When I go check my buildings, you will find two types of different buildings. The first ones are your standard production buildings. These are your buildings with the production method to convert some resources into some different resources. So here I have a weapon manufactory that consumes some raw good and some other processed good like tools to transform them into weapons. That is a standard building. You have them in many different fashions. You have the urban buildings, which usually have burgers. You have your rural buildings, like the sand pit, which consumes tools and wood to make sand. And then you have your villages, like here's this farming village. Despite most people building villages for their very useful utility effects, like here the farming village giving a lot of local food capacity and some percentage food production, it still remains a production building as it converts some goods into other. Here it's clay and tools into livestock. These are the production buildings. Now the later category of buildings, the one I want to actually talk about today, are the utility buildings. And for some very typical for these, something very typical for these is the fact that they have a production method, but it doesn't produce goods. It only consumes them. Here for this irrigation, for example, it consumes a tenth of a tool per month for a utility effect. When I talk about utility buildings, I talk about all buildings that have a production method, but do not produce goods. So for example, barracks, which is a military building, only has a production method which consumes here this whole slew of goods, but do not produce goods. It's the same also for here, the marketplace. It consumes goods, but it does not produce them, despite giving you some form of income because it gives you trade capacity, which you can use to make trades. Something very important to consider with these utility buildings is that they work differently than the production buildings. Production buildings consume goods and produce some other goods that they sell on the local market, and generally they are income positive, and then you gain that income in form of tax. If they're not efficient, then they cost you money, but most of the time the building will start kicking off pops until the building is at least neutral in terms of money, or they just kick off all pops if it's really that unproductive. You can subsidize the building so that they still continue on working while costing you the money, but it's generally not the way to play. The utility buildings are different. Utility buildings always cost you money as the state. Of course, it's a building that you as the state pay for to gain the utility bonus, like having the army or the trade capacity. The maintenance of these buildings are represented here in this slot. And if I, for example, go here onto one of the regimental camp, which is a military building, it gives me monthly manpower, then you can see that it costs me quite a bit of money. And if I now go back and scroll into one in specific, like this one, you can see what goods it costs me. And something that you quickly realize is that the building cost me about 10.8 ducats here. In this tooltip here, it says it cost me 10.8 ducats. But when you scroll over it, you will see that the total price of all the goods is way higher than the 10.8 ducats. You can see here that it costs me about 100 ducats, actually. This is because something that only these buildings have, and only the utility buildings, those that have a production method without output goods, I want to be very clear on that, have this modifier that their cost is reduced by 80%, and you as the government or the player only pay 20% of that goods cost. Furthermore, you can get to up to minus 75% cost of these 20% scaling with Cron power. So here I am at around 75% Cron power, and that is about minus 50% of these 20%. And of course, if you halve 20 by 2, it's 10. So I'm currently only paying 10% of what the buildings actually consumes in terms of goods. If you are experienced with economy or you have played some Victoria 3 before, you quickly realize that all these goods here, the firearms, leather, and weaponry especially, are the main driver for these buildings in terms of costs, that they stimulate your economy, that it creates demands for your buildings, and then these buildings become productive. And you can get some of that money in form of tax or in form of trade income. And that's basically what I've been doing here. I'm currently extremely rich despite having 50% inflation because I've been screwed over by Mr. John Law. There is a terrible event for France that basically destroys your economy, but here I'm just was so rich before that it doesn't matter, and I still have such a powerful economy. And if you check my trade income, you can see that all the money I make from trade is from the goods that are demanded by these military buildings. These are the utility buildings that demand the most goods and thus are the most productive. And if I go onto them, I can see how much percentage of the trade income I actually get, because trade income normally scales with your Cron power. And here I'm playing a merchant republic, so I actually gain my Cron power, which is here 74.86%, plus 25% from the merchant republic. That means I gain nearly 100% of the trade income. And if you remember what I just said, I'm only paying 10% for these buildings. So what that means is I have 10 times more income from these buildings than what they actually cost me. If you look at my current France starts off very big, of course, but I haven't expanded at all. Nearly, I only took just a bit of land here in Switzerland and a bit here in Flanders, but nothing crazy. And you can see that my income still is extremely high, and that is because I was playing tall and I actually spammed these military buildings. I have 2.5 million manpower in a country of 43 million people. So basically, I have over 5% of my population. As an army, despite not expanding at all, I'm only building these manpower buildings because they give me money, they create demand, and this demand is by far the best way to scale up your economy, which is, in my opinion, nonsensical. Because when you're building an army, it should be very costly to you, the player, and I don't know why you only pay 20% of it, and you can even reduce it like I did to 10%, and then the 90% of the rest of the money basically comes out from nowhere. The state is not paying for it, no one is paying for it. And yeah, that's really in essence the problem I have. One thing more that I want to be clear on is, although there is something strange happening with infrastructure or the utility buildings when it comes to market access. Here you see I have a market in Metz, which is quite far from the capital and only has 65%, 65%, sorry, market access. And if you look here at my irrigation, I pay 0.2 ducats per month, and it consumes 0.6 tools from the 6 levels of irrigation. However, if you look at the production methods here, you will see that I'm only consuming 0.39 goods. That's because market access also scales the production methods goods consumption from these utility buildings. So it actually, you pay full price for the 0.6 tools here, or at least you pay the full 20%. Yeah, it's but then the amount of goods that actually gets demanded in your market scales with market access. So in theory, that is a factor that makes this mechanic more balanced, in the sense that if you build a lot of infrastructure or utility buildings in low market access provinces, the consumption of goods gets quite low. So you could say it's a balancing factor. For me, I think it just makes the game really complicated that you have this additional rule. In my opinion, you should have basically the goods gets consumed fully. So here you should get the consumption of tools of 0.6 and not 0.39. And you should, as the state, pay fully for your infrastructure, like Victoria 3 does. Your buildings are very expensive in Victoria 3, and generally when you tax your people later on, you can hope to regain a part of the cost of the building. If your buildings cost 100% and you gain 50% back from tax or trade, then it reduces the cost of the building per se. Here you're not incentivized at all to have cheap consume goods. Here I'm not incentivized to have cheap goods, cheap tools, sorry. I will have if I have to pay it for fully. But here, because I get a 90% discount on everything, then I wanted to have actually high prices because my margin gets way better. If I have some item, some tools, let's say they were costing, instead of 3 ducats, they were costing 6 ducats, I will gain 5.4 ducats for each tool if the price was doubled, because 0.6 will be the 10% cost I actually have to pay. But if the tool costs 3 ducats, then I only gain 2.7. So that is something very strange. And in comparison, Victoria 3, you really want your goods that you as the state has to buy, you have to put the price very low, because else it's just a big strain on your country. Here it's actually not what you want, because expensive goods for your buildings is actually a positive thing. And now I want to show you, alongside the trade system, I was talking about trade shenanigans in the titles. And as you can see here, the main driver of my economy is trade. And it's not only because I have a 100% share, which is much harder to do with taxes. It's much harder to gain 100% on tax, although I'm nearly achieving it on the poor clergy, which I'm completely robbing. But you can see that most of my economy comes from the trade of all the input goods I need for my barracks, like weaponry, firearms, and leather. I need in equal amounts, and all these goods have the same base price. How does it work? Well, let me just show you quickly. Let's select all my markets. I have a total of 6 markets. And what I did is I fully built out all of these markets with firearms, with weaponry. No, so I'm sorry. I built all these markets with regimental camps and barracks. They're fully built in every location. And so the demands for firearms, for example, the demand for leather and for weaponry is exactly the same, because they use the exact same amount in the production method for the barracks, and they all cost 3 ducats. The other 2 goods I mostly ignore because they're required in way lower amounts. So I focus on these 3 items first. And I fully built all the provinces I could with these buildings. And you can see, for example, here in Bordeaux, I have 300, a demand for 300 firearms. Here, 165. Here, nearly 300 again. Here in Paris, it's 500. And here it's 160. So I have a very high demand for firearms. I also have some in Montargis, in the very interesting market, but as you can see, I'm also exporting a ton. I'm also producing a ton in Montargis. And that is where I'm actually managing the fact that how utility building works, how they reward having high prices. Normally, if I were to produce the demand in each of these markets, then the price will gravitate towards 3 ducats. Because if I produce, for example, here the same amount in Quimper and consume the same amount in Quimper, in the province itself, the price will gravitate towards 3 ducats. However, because here I'm using trade, I actually have a way lower price in Montargis and a way higher price in all other markets. You can see that most of the firearms cost 5 ducats in all markets except Montargis, where it's absolutely cheap at 1.8 ducats of a base price of 3 ducats. That's because trade works in a very mysterious and strange way in Europa Universalis 5, and that is that when you import or export a good, it only has half the impact on demands or supply on the end price. So it's a bit complicated to understand at first, but here is a good way to demonstrate. Montargis is producing a ton of firearms, 2,200. And here you can see it has a consumption of 2,052 firearms. So actually it's quite balanced. It's actually quite close. The price will be a tiny bit lower because I have an excess of 181 firearms. But if you check the price, you will see at effective supply and effective demand that it's not true, that the effective demand is way lower than effective supply. That is because the Montargis market is exporting all these firearms to the other markets and at very high rate. So as you can see, I'm exporting more weapons to Paris than I'm actually consuming in Montargis itself. And this export only has half the impact on the demand, which means that the price gets very low in Montargis. And the inverse is true. Here in Paris, there is a really overabundance of firearms. You can see that I'm consuming nearly 500, but I have around 650, and that in total I have quite a bit more firearms than I actually have demand in Paris. But the price still gets a 50% bonus nearly because the effective supply, all the guns I export via Montargis to Paris, actually only have half the impact price in Paris. And what that means is that all the weapons I export from Montargis to Paris or from Montargis to Narbonne, Quimper, Metz, Bordeaux, they all have stupidly high prices. I get an enormous amount of money from exporting these very cheap weapons from Montargis to all of these markets. And the fact that the infrastructure, the buildings, the utility buildings, the barracks themselves cost me only 10% of the money, that means that I'm actually really profitable for me to keep all these prices high in all these different markets instead of just building the buildings I need in each of these markets and have the price sitting at 3 ducats. Because if I were to want to push the price higher in these markets, I will need lower supply of weapons than the consumption. But then I start getting problems of the buildings not functioning anymore, and also it's not exactly that profitable. Just to demonstrate you, let's just quickly go to one of these markets like Montargis, and I'll show you some of the trades I make. The big trade, as you can see here, is from Montargis to Paris, and I'm here using an enormous amount of trade capacity to move all of these weapons to Paris. And as you can see, I'm only paying 1,000 for these guns and reselling them at 2,600 ducats. It's an enormous amount of ducats, and the trade route maintenance is quite low. I have a lot of modifiers to reduce it, but it will only be at full price about 200 ducats of trade route maintenance. And I will still get a lot of profit. And as you can see, the margins here are really crazy, like 3 ducats here. And if I go to different markets like Metz and I check on the exports, you can see that leather, weaponry, firearms all get imported in at a very high price. And I nearly get all of this money because I have so much crown power and I am a merchant republic. In addition to that, I also have about 10% trade efficiency, which gives me a quite nice buff on this very expensive leather. If it were costing 3 ducats, then I will get only 0.3 from 10% trade efficiency. Here it nearly costs 5 ducats, so I get 0.5 ducats per trade capacity for my 10% trade efficiency, which also furthermore increases the profitability of this insane trade. So yeah, that's basically what I want to tell about the utility buildings. They are way too broken, and I believe that if the game, the economy needs to, if the if the devs wants the economy to be balanced, they need to increase the price of utility buildings to fully reflect their cost in terms of goods. I do think that the best thing they can do is make it so that all these buildings, instead here of paying 3,700, I should be paying 37,000 ducats, and that I want to recoup all the money that cost by increasing my tax rate, my trade income. I will also be incentivized to not do what I am currently doing, and instead of having nearly all my firearms and leather and weaponry costing 5 ducats in most markets, that I reduce the price to about 2 ducats, and then I will only pay around 15,000 ducats for all of these barracks, and I will be a lot more. Um, I will be thinking a lot more before building all of these actually useless barracks and regiment camps, because in this game I'm not declaring war. I haven't declared a single war except in the 100 Years' War, because yeah, the English must die. But I haven't declared war since the 100 Years' War. But I'm still building this military buildings since it's just so powerful. Just in comparison, the commoners consume 5,000 ducats. The bourgeoisie are also around 5,000 ducats, so that's 10k ducats, 13k ducats with the pastors, and then the patricians consume 2,000 ducats. That makes a total of 15,000 ducats worth of goods that the estates consume, and still I'm consuming way more with all of this military buildings. Also, one more thing is that these marketplaces are also excellent to build in the early game, because the production method consumes jewelry. Jewelry is very nice goods to have demand for. And the fact that it is in utility building, so it actually creates a lot of demand without costing you a lot, thanks to the fact you get the 80% discount. You also gain trade capacity, so it gives you money in yet another way. And normally, in a normal game, I would say that the cost of trade should be reflected by you having to pay for the building, you having to pay for the trade route maintenance, and then you gain some money from the trade capacity, and you have to subtract the cost of the building plus the trade route maintenance. However, because this building produces more money than it consumes, then you actually get the money from trade capacity, the trade you get from taxation, and trade from the goods that are required for this building, and then only you have to pay for the trade route maintenance. And this ring here is already giving you 0.5 in terms of money, is giving you a demand of 0.5 of jewelry. So it actually already pays for the trade route maintenance independently of what you do with the trade capacity. So it's actually insane. And then the trade capacity is, of course, really nice if you want to do some shenanigans like what I'm doing this game with my trade income. And the market access is also great because, as I said, if you have low market access, you have a lesser production here. So you can actually have 100% market access if you build like 10 of these in cities that are close to the market center, and you can get the few percentage you will be missing with this. So the marketplace is just great. It's not the best building to get a lot of money from, because the goods consumption is very low compared to something like a regiment camp, which consume on its own very many ducats. So like this building consumes about 13 to 15 ducats on its own, while the grain marketplace only consumes about 1 ducat. Yeah. Last thing I want to show you before ending this is another trade trick, which in this case has nothing to do with the utility building, but I thought was very funny, is basically creating the same as the current AI bubble. Is I have here a production of jewelry in Montargis, but as you can see, most of the jewelry I get here is from Paris. And it's nearly like 3/4 of my supply of jewelry in Montargis comes from Paris. Now look at what I'm using it for. Oh, I'm using it to export it back to Paris. Nearly all of it. And Paris, it's the same. And you might think, well, why am I doing this? This can't be profitable. The prices are really close together. Although Paris is a bit more expensive, but the price equilibrium, as you can see, is very similar. Now I go to Paris market. And here I'm losing a tiny bit of money, but really not much. But the thing that is mostly important and why I'm doing this trade is that with trade efficiency, you could actually get money even for this trade, even if the jewelry is more expensive in Paris, because here I have about 10% trade efficiency. I sadly lose some from mercantilism because I have too many markets and I lose trade efficiency from that. If I was going 3 markets, I would probably be positive here in terms of profitability. And what this does is I'm trading back and forth and I'm actually making a lot of money from it. Here it's negative, but in the price will stabilize and then it will be positive again here because the price is very high in Paris. It's actually giving me 2.05 ducats per trade capacity. And that is just because the trade efficiency. I can trade back and forth, and here if it costs 5 ducats and here it costs 5 ducats, and I have 10% trade efficiency, then I actually gain 5.5 ducats or half a ducat worth of profit. Then I have to pay the trade room maintenance. Here I have a 90% discount, so it will be 0.05. Or you just have even more trade efficiency. If you have 20% trade efficiency, you gain a whole ducat per trade on this jewelry. It's actually even more because jewelry is only consuming half a trade efficiency. So you actually have to calculate 10% of 10 ducats per trade efficiency gives you 1 ducat. Here I'm at about 10%, so I gain 1 ducat just for trading this jewelry back and forth between Paris and Montargis. So if you play a game with a lot of trade efficiency, it might be more worth to use this trade efficiency to trade back and forth to markets, because eventually the price will equalize as well, because even though the demand and supply from trade is only halved compared to a normal market, if you trade back and forth and have like 10,000 supply to 10,000 demand, eventually it's going to overpower every demand or production in that market. And then you can just trade back and forth and make money just if you have trade efficiency. And since jewelry is so efficient and gold is the same with a base price of 10 ducats and 1 transport cost, jewelry just happens to have half of these values. It's, however, similar because you don't pay much for trade route maintenance, and it makes it very efficient for trade capacity to gain the trade efficiency boost on it. So you can actually, with 20% trade efficiency, you gain 2 ducats per trade capacity used in that trade. If you were doing this with like the weaponry I showed you earlier, you will only gain 0.6 ducats because 3 times 1.2 is 3.6. So it's less efficient use of your trade capacity. So you just do this with jewelry or with gold, if you have gold in your market, and you can gain a lot of money, and the trade can eventually become more profitable than anything else in the market, because even though anything else in the market can also have a high price, the trade capacity, the low trade capacity cost of gold and jewelry just make trade efficiency that much more efficient. So at some point, then you will just be trading jewelry back and forth. So I think that also needs to be addressed. I don't think it's normal to be able to just trade jewelry back and forth and just use some magic money creation from this trade efficiency modifier. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and leave a comment in the comment section if you have some ideas how to change this system. I think it needs to be changed. I definitely think that it's one of the reasons why the economy feels so bloated so quickly, the fact that you can get so much money so easily because you can just build bridges to nowhere, or here a ton of military infrastructure. Having 5% of your population have manpower shouldn't be a way to make money. It should be an immense strain on the country's economy and not a huge boon for it. So, yeah, I hope you had a nice video, and I see you in the next one. Bye.